Well, thanks very much, Gabby, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone, wherever you are. It's very exciting to have Ndongo with us. What is this evening in Adelaide? I've had the privilege of seeing him speak or hearing him speak on a number of occasions, and he's one of the leading MMT economists of, if I might say, the younger generation than some of our founders. He's a Senegalese development economist, as well as one of the world's leading modern monetary theory economists. He's head of research and policy for the Africa region of the International Development Economics Associates and program manager at the West Africa office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. He is an expert on monetary sovereignty, was previously a technical advisor to the Presidency of the Republic of Senegal, and not quite so relevant, but very impressive to me, is a former world champion of French language Scrabble. So thank you very much for joining us, and a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, Gabriel. I'm really pleased to be here to have the opportunity to exchange with the audience. I really thank you for this invitation. My presentation today will be about the CFA franc and monetary sovereignty in West Africa. And if you allow me, I will share my screen so that the audience will be able to follow my PowerPoint presentation. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. 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 So the CFA franc is the acronym for a currency created in December 26, 1945. That means during colonial times. Here in the image, you could see the decree signed by the provisional government of France at the time, because the CFA franc was a wartime creature. This decree was signed by General Charles de Gaulle, his Minister of Finance, René Pleven, and the Minister of Foreign Colonies, Jacques Soustelle. In fact, the context was that at that time, there was this principle called monetary unity, meaning you have one currency under different forms for one empire. So basically, for the most parts within the French Empire, you had the French currency circulating under different forms. You would have different banknotes, for example. But after the war, Second World War, the French economy was in ruins. And there were shortages, high level of inflation, and the gold reserves of France had depleted. So one technical question arose in that period. Should we have a uniform rate of devaluation across the empire so that this so-called monetary unity, one currency, one empire, would be maintained? Or should we rather have different rates of devaluation of the franc across territories? And so it was the second decision that was taken secretly by the French Minister of Finance at that time, René Pleven. And so the devaluation of the franc, the metropolitan franc, gave rise to the CFA franc in December 25, 1945. But the following day, December 26, the CFA franc was declared to the International Monetary Fund, which was just born. So this was the context of the creation of the CFA franc. And originally, the acronym CFA franc meant the franc of the French colonies in Africa. So it circulated in the sub-Saharan Africa part of the French colonial empire. So something like 16 territories. But what was striking at that time was that when the CFA franc was created, it had an external value higher than the French franc itself. That means that the CFA franc, one CFA franc was exchanged with 1.70 French franc. In 1948, the French franc would be devalued, but the rate of devaluation would be different in the colonies. So in 1948, one CFA franc was exchanged with 2 French franc. Obviously, the British did not do the same with their colonies, because their colonies had colonial currencies, but their currencies had external values that were, in line with their level of economic development. That means the British pound had a external value compared to the colonies, to the currencies circulating in the British colonies. But the French choose to give their African colonies an overvalued currency, because it was a way for them to make the colonies contribute to their effort of economic reconstruction after the war. Because when you have an overvalued currency, that means it's a kind of a subsidy for imports. That means you have the purchasing power, more purchasing power to buy imports. And the French economy needed to have some kind of captive markets, because it was not that competitive. At the same time, when you have an overvalued currency, it will be difficult to export abroad. And in some sense, most of these products coming from the colony were no longer that competitive. And France managed to reconquer the trade shares it lost during the war period. And in some sense, the CFA franc was born in that specific period to allow the colonies to participate with the reconstruction of the French Empire. But now we are in 2025, but the CFA franc remains a colonial currency. And I am not saying that to denigrate or to calumniate, but because it is still legally controlled by the French Treasury, and it is still operating in 14 African countries. And you could see them here. You have 8 countries in West Africa, because when we talk about the CFA franc, in fact, it's 2 currencies. One in West Africa called the Franc of the Financial Community in West Africa, and the other is the Franc of the Financial Corporation, Central Africa. So you have 2 currencies, same acronym, same principles as we see. So in West Africa, you have 8 countries. You have mine, Senegal, you have Mali, you have Burkina Faso, you have Niger, you have Ivory Coast, Togo, Benin, and Guinea-Bissau, a former Portuguese colony who joined the CFA franc zone in 1997. In Central Africa, you have 6 countries. You have Chad, you have Central African Republic, Congo, Brazzaville, you have Cameroon, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, a former Spanish colony who joined the zone in 1985. So these 14 countries use the CFA franc. In fact, as I said, you have 2 monetary unions having the same acronym. Each monetary union has its own central bank and its own currency, its own coins, its own banknotes, etc. But they are all under the management of the French Treasury. There's another country that does not appear in this map. It's the Republic of Comoros. They have their national currency, but in fact, it functions exactly like the CFA franc, because it is also under the tutelage of the French Treasury. But their currency is not named the CFA franc, but it functions exactly like the CFA franc. The only difference is that they have the national currency, and the peg against the euro has a different value. So from 1945 to nowadays, the CFA franc rested on 3 main pillars and so-called 2 counterparts. The first pillar is the fixed peg to the French currency. So the French currency was the French franc until 1999, and after it had been replaced with the euro. So when you have a fixed peg against a currency, that means that your currency will have a stable value against the anchor currency. So the CFA franc used to be very stable against the French franc. So the evolution of the CFA franc would be given, for example, by the evolution of the French currency vis-a-vis the US dollar. And it is still the case now. The evolution of the CFA franc is given by the evolution of the euro against the US dollar, for example. The second principle is the free transferability, meaning that the free movement of capital and incomes between CFA franc countries and also between CFA franc countries and France. That means that French investors could freely repatriate their capital, also repatriate their dividends, their profits, and so on. The third principle look a bit pompous, convertibility guarantee by the French Treasury. In fact, this means that the French Treasury and not the Bank of France, the French Treasury promises to lend money to the central banks in West Africa, in Central Africa, if ever they are short of foreign exchange reserves. For example, if they have to make some external payments in US dollar, euro, and they do not have enough foreign exchange, the French Treasury will allow them an overdraft because these central banks had opened uh, an account, an operation account at the French Treasury, and they are obliged to deposit a share of their foreign exchange reserves at the French Treasury. So at the time of independence, it was 100%. This has been lowered to 65% in the mid-1970s, and in the 2000s, this mandatory deposit rate had been lowered to 50%. So that means, for example, if an exporter from the CFA franc zone, let's say an exporter from Cote d'Ivoire, export cocoa, let's say, to the US, this cocoa exporter will receive, for example, 1 million US dollar. In fact, the 1 million US dollar will be credited to the bank, to the account of the central bank, let's say in New York, and the central bank will convert this 1 million into CFA franc and will pay the exporter. And this 1 million, half of it will have to be deposited at the French Treasury. To simplify, that is the basic mechanism. Every 3 days, the central bank have to make sure that at least half of their foreign exchange, will be deposited with the French Treasury. See, this is what has been called the centralization of the foreign exchange reserves. So this is one of the counterparts of the loans that the French Treasury promises to lend to the central banks whenever they are short of foreign exchange reserves. But actually, the central banks have never used, in fact, it was not correct to say have never used, have seldom used this convertibility guarantee because the mechanism is designed so that this central bank will never need an overdraft from the treasury. That is how it works. So the second counterpart is that the French government, French Minister of Finance, is represented in the organs of both central banks with implicit veto power. This also has been the norm. In 2019, there had been a kind of reform to remove these representatives from the French Treasury, but in fact, it was not a substantial reform to the extent that well, there is one representative that is appointed by the 8 countries in West Africa and France, and that representative would make daily reports to the French Treasury, etc. So it's not really a substantive change. But what has also to be said is that since 1999, the CFA franc are under the legal tutelage of both the French Treasury and the Eurozone political and monetary authorities. When I say under legal tutelage, there is a legal agreement between the French Treasury and the central bank, and also another agreement between the French Treasury and the 8 countries using the CFA franc in West Africa, but also the 6 countries using the CFA franc in Central Africa. And when France decided to replace its currency, the franc, with the euro, there had been an agreement between France and the Eurozone political and monetary authorities to say that, well, you have to respect the budget criteria of the Eurozone, for example, having less than 3% deficit and so on, less than 60% debt to GDP ratio and so on. So your guarantee should not expose you. You have to meet these criteria. So there was an agreement signed between France and the Eurozone political and monetary authorities in November 1998. So just before the launch of the euro in 1999. And so this agreement says that, well, if the nature of the guarantee of France has to change, the Eurozone political and monetary authorities should be informed. If the CFA franc has to be devalued, the Eurozone political and monetary authorities should also be informed. And in case the CFA zone is to be enlarged, there is also the need to consult the Eurozone political and monetary authorities. So that is how this system is working now. And yeah, here you could see some banknotes issued by the Central Bank of West Africa. And you could see some notes. One CFA franc, in fact, 1 euro is exchanged with 656 CFA franc. So the highest banknote is 10,000 CFA franc, and it's basically 1.5, let's say, euros, more or less 1.5 or 1.6 US dollars. So the plan of this discussion is first, why the CFA franc survived decolonization? Second, what are the economic benefits for France to maintaining this? The part three, what are the supposed benefits for the CFA franc using countries? And what are the alternatives to the CFA franc in the conclusion? So part one, why the CFA franc survived decolonization? In fact, with their accession to independence, mostly all former African colonies decided to issue their own currency as a symbol of their newly acquired national sovereignty. So monetary blocks, colonial monetary blocks in the continent were progressively dismantled, like the Sterling area, the Belgian monetary zone, Escudo zone, the zone, monetary and trade zone controlled by Portugal in Africa, and the Peseta zone controlled by the Spanish in Africa and some other parts of the world. All of these zones were dismantled except for the CFA franc zone, the franc zone. Why? Because France anticipated that decolonization would be inevitable. So they decided to concede independence, political independence, but without a real handover of sovereign powers on sovereign domains. France conditioned the accession to independence of its former colonies in sub-Saharan Africa to the signature of so-called cooperation agreements in domains like foreign trade, foreign affairs, external trade, currency management, defense, strategic raw materials, etc. So basically the deal was, I grant your territory its national independence, but I'll remain sovereign over all the domains above. And in fact, there have been some studies, before the granting of independence to these countries. For example, this book was written by the former Director of Economic Affairs and Planning at the Ministries of Overseas France. Ministry of Overseas France means Ministry of Colonies. And it was called Les chances économiques de la communauté franco-africaine, meaning that the opportunities of the French African community. And he said in that book, 1957, a chronic shortage of hard currency means financial dependence on foreign countries. Financial dependence means political dependence. So the independence of French policy is linked to France's ability to do without American aid. As such, maintaining the French community would well be a necessary condition. In fact, they were saying basically that if you want to have some room for maneuver, some political independence, you need not be in a position of a shortage of US dollar because, as you know, after World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Conference, and this conference cemented the role of the US dollar at the global stage. So the US dollar would be converted only into gold at a specified rate, and the other currencies were supposed to be backed against the US dollar. And these countries, I mean, in Europe, needed to reconstruct their economies. And so they had a kind of a shortage of hard currency of US dollars, and the Plan Marshall, to some extent, gave them some US dollars for reconstruction. But the French under de Gaulle were much more ambitious, and they said, we want to have independence from the US. So there were two issues. First, how to have access to goods and services in their own currency, in French franc, and also how to have some sources of foreign income, let's say of US dollars. And the colonies were really, and also the colonies, but also the future independent countries would be really instrumental in providing, foreign exchange to France, because these colonies were in a situation of trade deficit vis-a-vis France, but they were in a situation of trade surpluses vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So they were accumulating US dollar reserves, and those US dollar reserves were completely controlled by France. That was why he said that maintaining the French community would well be a condition. But there was also this philosopher, French liberal philosopher, very smart. He said that, in fact, granting political independence will not threaten French economic interests in its former empire. In fact, as long as you maintain the monetary zone, you will reap maybe most of the advantages without the burden of having to administer them politically. So that's what he said in an article he published in 1959. That means 1 year before the decolonization process in most of Francophone Africa. He said, what I think we can say with almost scientific certainty is that from a strictly economic point of view, the advantage for metropolitan France is the participation of the overseas territory in the Franc zone, not sovereignty of France over its colonies. That means, well, give them independence, but maintain the Franc zone. And here you could see some examples of so-called cooperation agreements. That means you have independence, but you don't have any sovereignty. For example, this one, quote, the Republic of Gabon commits to facilitating the storage of strategic materials and the products to the benefit of the French armed forces. Should it become necessary for security reasons, it also pledges to limit or prohibit export to other countries. And this was signed by the Gabon authorities the day of the proclamation of independence of Gabon. And these are, disclosed documents that could be accessed by anyone. For example, in the other countries, territories in Equatorial Africa, you could read the states of Equatorial Africa confirm their membership to the monetary union of which they are members within the Franc zone. All the revenue and expenditure operations of the states of Equatorial Africa will be made via the transfer or purchase of foreign currency on the Paris foreign exchange market. That means that all their external operations would be centralized through Paris. That means the French Treasury, the Bank of France, would manage all their external trade, all their financial relationships with the other countries. And this was signed by Congo, Chad, and Central African Republic. I mean, all these countries, they sing that, all these leaders, because most of them also was trained in France. And you could see this example of unconditional independence in a letter sent by the Prime Minister at the time, Michel Debré, to his Gabonese counterpart, Léon Bar, in July 1960. And the spirit of the letter was described as such by historian Alfred Grosser. We grant independence on the condition that the state, having gained its independence, endeavors to respect the cooperation agreements. The one does not go without the other. So most of these leaders were trained in France, and some of them even having seated at the French parliament as member of parliaments, because in the French system, they allowed, their former colonies to organize elections after World War II to have some representation at the French parliament. So most of these leaders were, members of parliaments, and they accepted to sign these agreements, all of them except for Sékou Touré, who had a different background because he was a trade unionist, Guinean trade unionist, and also he demanded the independence of Guinea, which he obtained through a referendum in 1958, 2 years before the other African countries, in fact, became independent. So you could see here the image of Sékou Touré, born in 1922, and he was in power from 1958 to his death, 1984. But when Guinea decided to leave the CFA franc to reclaim independence, the French organized something they called Operation Persil. Operation Persil was a destabilization program implemented in Guinea by the French Secret Services, training and arming political figures from the opposition to overthrow Sékou Touré. So one aspect of this operation consisted in using the printing presses of the French Secret Services to create counterfeited Guinean banknotes and to put them en masse into the country. And here you could see the image of the chief of French Secret Services in Africa at the time. And he said in a documentary movie, and he also wrote a book about that, the operation was a total success. Guinea's economy already very weak, never fully recovered. So Guinea went through a period of very high inflation and the economy was destabilized. And so this was a message to all the other countries saying that if you want to take the Guinean path, you will face retaliation from France. There have been other episodes of imperialist repression, but for the sake of time, I will not able to talk about them. But this is to say that this has been one part of the explanation why the CFA franc has been existing until now, because most of the leaders have been committed to French interests, or the leaders who wanted to have more independence from France were ousted from power or destabilized. So part two, what are the economic benefits for France to maintain this system? So this is a very controversial, issue, because most of the, defenders of the CFA franc would say the underdevelopment of these countries has nothing to do with the currency, etc. you see. But what is interesting is that the Kennedy administration already knew how the CFA system works. In fact, there had been a memorandum written by the team of the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, on January 1963, 28th of January 1963. In fact, JFK wanted to have more relationships with Francophone Africa, but De Gaulle was very jealous of that, and De Gaulle were really scared, of U.S. influence in Francophone Africa. So JFK asked Dean was how it is possible that the French gave more aid to their former empire than the US for the whole continent of Africa. That should not be possible. Please provide answers. And Dean Rusk asked his team to make a report, a 90 pages report. And basically the summary of the report is as following. France's control over the monetary policies and foreign exchange reserve of its former African dependency, coupled with a host of other trading relationships, enables it to recoup its assistance to these countries. This legacy from prior French colonial relationship implies a degree of external control over a country's financial economic policies that would be unacceptable under other circumstances. Dean Rusk was very optimistic to some extent that he said, oh, this could not last long because no sovereign country would ever accept that. This will disappear. But unfortunately, we still have the CFA franc. There has been a report also published by a public institution, the French Economic and Social Council, in 1970, that explains very well for me the logic of the benefits that France reaped from the CFA franc. It's difficult to come up with a number to say that France is obtaining every year, I mean, X US dollars from the CFA franc, but you could see the logic of the benefits. So the first benefit is that France could pay its imports from France zone in its own currency. This is another version of the so-called exorbitant privilege. That means that, I mean, there is basically no difference between external and domestic payments because you could access imports using your own currency. And this was very important for France because at the time, France has a very weak currency, and the French currency was devalued 10 times between 1948 and 1986. But having the possibility to buy your own your export in your own currency, and also having the possibility to appropriate the foreign exchange reserves of your former colonies were instrumental in some sense to save foreign currency for France and keep up its own exchange rate. The second benefit was that the French companies operating in the zone benefited from large and stable outlets for trade. And generally, these French companies were not competitive on world stage. So they had a kind of a niche in Francophone Africa. And also, the French economy benefited from a surplus with regard to the Francophone countries, because at that time we were in a system of fixed exchange rates. And also, these countries provided foreign exchange reserves to the French economy. And also the French companies have the guaranteed freedom to repatriate their incomes and capital without any foreign exchange risk. When we say foreign exchange risk, that means that the central bank will always have enough foreign exchange to allow for the repatriation of profits, dividends, and so on. This is also thanks to the free transfer policy and the fact that France decides the zone's exchange and monetary policy. Another advantage is that France enjoys a system of political control serving its own economic interest that doesn't cost it anything. Why? Because in fact, the convertibility guarantee has been rarely put into effect. Between 1960 and now, the convertibility guarantee, that means the Treasury extending loans to the central banks, this happened only between 1980 and 1999 because we were in a period of debt crisis, and the French did not want to devalue the CFA franc. And most French companies, anticipated that the devaluation would be inevitable. And to allow for, the French companies to, to repatriate their capital, their incomes, French provided overdrafts during that period. So that means that it's just a period of 10 years during a whole period of more than 6 decades. So that means the central bank had been accumulated foreign exchange, at the French treasury, you see. But the thing is, these foreign exchange deposited at the French treasury were subjected to negative interest rates. When we talk about negative interest rates, that means that For example, let's say the French Treasury offers the central bank a nominal interest rate of 5%, and the inflation rate is 10%. That means that in net terms, you have negative interest rate, -5. And that was the case. And when you have a negative interest rates, it is as if these central banks were paying the French Treasury to keep their own foreign exchange. So this is a system that is not costly for France. That's why, despite all the criticism, France has never taken any step to remove itself from the CFA franc, because there is no net cost incurred by France in maintaining this system. There has been also a very strange ruling by the French Conseil d'Etat, which is the highest French administrative court. And in that ruling, they said, in fact, the management and control of the BEAC, which is the Central Bank of Central Africa, issuing the Central African CFA franc, he said the management and control of the BEAC is notably ensured by France's representation within this body. The activity of the BEAC, which governs monetary cooperation between France and actually it's 6 Central African states, is of particular interest to the French economy. So that means that maintaining this monetary system is somehow vital for French interest in Africa. So part 3, what are the supposed benefits for the CFA franc using countries? Generally, the argument for monetary unions is that maybe this will lower transaction costs. It's a microeconomic argument. You will have more trade between the members of the monetary union. Did that happen? The answer is no. The trade within the African zone fund is just 10% of the external trade of its members. And the trade between Central African countries averaged 1.5% of the external trade over the period 1995 to 2021. So you would ask, why would you share this common currency? It's not about trade. Did these countries have more financial attractiveness? And generally, when they talk about financial attractiveness, they are talking about, attracting foreign direct investment. They would say, oh, we have a fixed exchange rate and we have low inflation. So this is attractive to foreign investors. But when you look at the data, you see that in West Africa, Ghana has its own national currency. It is a flexible exchange rate regime. And until 2019, Ghana recorded a stock of foreign direct investment higher than all the 8 countries using the CFA franc combined. When we take stock of foreign direct investment, is net cumulative flows of foreign direct investment, let's say, over the last 5 decades. In Central Africa, you have the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has a dollarized currency, but you could see still that, Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo had a higher stock of foreign direct investment than 5 out of the 6 countries belonging to the CEMAC. So you could not say that the CFA franc, is an asset that provides financial attractiveness to the country using it. Lower of inflation, exchange rate stability, yes. But as we'll see, this has been the result of a deflationary framework implying huge economic costs. And namely, in fact, there have been no long-term development in the CFA franc countries. Here, I gave the inflation rates on average between 1996 and 2019. Why 1996? Because there had been a very brutal devaluation of the CFA franc in 1994, decided by the French and the IMF against the will of most African countries, because the currency became so overvalued and it had to be corrected. But they divided from one day to another the CFA franc by 50%, and this created a lot of inflation in these countries, imported inflation. But after this period, you could see that Senegal, my country, had an inflation rate of 1.5% during this period. And in fact, for all the countries in West African Monetary Union, the rate of inflation had been 2% or less during this period. And you could see, for example, here, we have just imported the inflation rate of the Eurozone. France 1.3, Germany 1.4. So in fact, in quote unquote, we have been better in terms of inflation rate than most of the countries across the world. China, United States, Australia, Korea, Brazil, India. All these dynamic countries, we managed to record inflation levels better, lower than them. And we are, most of our countries are ranked as least developed countries, because this is somehow due to the framework, which the peg to the euro to some extent. And this peg to the euro has been very harmful to the economic prospect of the African countries, because most of them, they are heavily dependent on agricultural exports to some extent. And here you could see, for example, in this graph between 2002 and 2008, the euro appreciated very strongly against the US dollar. If you look at the value, let's say October 22 and July 2008, you will see that the euro during this period appreciated by more than 90% against the US dollar. And all the goods that are exported generally are invoiced in US dollar. So that means that these countries have been, losing competitiveness just because they made the choice to peg their currency against the euro. And here you have a quote of a Senegalese economist in the case of in fact, showing the impact of the appreciation of the euro on the agricultural sector. He said, in the 2000-2009 period, the appreciation of the euro by 50% against the dollar made local rice 50% more extensive than Thai rice. That means the rice coming from Thailand, which is, as we know, priced in dollars. This price effect on the competitiveness of local rice represented a severe, almost unsurmountable blow to the local industry, which threatened to destroy all efforts made for the development of the rice sector in Senegal. In this context, the goal of food self-sufficiency faces serious limitations. More generally, all goods that are potentially candidates for import substitution, as well as those geared for export, are penalized by the presence of a strong euro. So that means these countries have been suffering just because they pegged their currency against the euro. And there is no economic rationale for that, but just political and rationality. But also you have other impacts of this colonial system. It's about, when you have to defend a peg, you have to make sure that, you don't grant many loans. I mean, the banking sector, because if you are import dependent, when people ask loans, they will buy products abroad. And when they buy products abroad, that means that this is a demand for foreign exchange, not really a demand for, domestic currency. And this could, deplete the stock of foreign exchange held by the central bank. So you have to make sure that, you control, credit allocation by the banking sector. So, but above that, the banking system itself is heavily foreign controlled. And generally, the result has been that you have bank loans that cost double-digit nominal interest rates in an environment of low inflation. That means the cost of credit is really high in these countries despite low inflation. And bank loans are mostly short-term. In my country, Senegal, which received, generally more bank loans, as a share of GDP compared to the others, you could see that 75% of all bank loans had a duration of less than 1 year. And 45% of all bank loans had a duration of less than 1 month. And bank loans are not targeted to agriculture industry, but mostly to trade and services. And in 2019, the total medium and long term, when we say medium and long term, is more than 1 year. Bank loans received by the Senegalese primary sector, which employs at least 50% of the labor force, amounted to 37.5 million US dollar. That same year, the Central Bank of West Africa granted loans that amounted to 85 million US dollar to its own staff, around 3,600 employees. So you could clearly see who this system benefits. And in Senegal, as in the rest of the CFA Franc countries, banks are mostly foreign owned. Until 2019, for example, in Senegal, more than 90% of banking assets in Senegal were controlled by the foreign banks. And when you read the literature, you could see generally that big banks do not, lend to small and medium enterprises, but, to big companies, etc. So this is also a constraint associated with this system. Here you have a table summarizing, the long-term underdevelopment or stagnation of the Franc zone. In the second column, you have the best level of real GDP per capita achieved by all these countries in the CFA Franc zone in constant 2015 US dollar terms. The third column is the year when the best level of real GDP per capita was achieved. The fourth column is the real GDP per capita in 2022. And the last column is the difference between the real GDP per capita in 2022 and the best level of real GDP per capita achieved, you see. So you take the first line, the second line, Equatorial Guinea. It's a small country, oil exporting country who should be normally very rich. In 2008, they achieved their best level of real GDP per capita, more than 14,000 US dollar in constant terms. But By 2022, the real GDP per capita declined almost by 58.2%. This is shocking. And there had been no war, nothing really, extraordinary. It's just that this country is exporting oil and all of its external income is in US dollar, but it made the choice to peg its currency, to the euro. The richest country in terms of the biggest country in terms of GDP is Cote d'Ivoire. And you could see that the best level of real GDP per capita achieved by Cote d'Ivoire was in 1978. That means 46 years ago. It was 3,000 basically. And by 2022, in fact, for Cote d'Ivoire, the real GDP per capita had a level, let's say, 90%, 9.5% lower than their best level of real GDP per capita achieved, in 1978. In my own country, in fact, our best level of real GDP per capita was 961. We caught up with that only in 2014. So you could see clearly that, in fact, for most of these countries, they have been poorer now in terms of real GDP per capita than they were, three or four decades ago. So this also, could be likened with what happened in countries like Greece. That means when you face an economic crisis in these countries, in fact, the only way you adjust to that is what is generally called internal devaluation. That means through more austerity policies. And unfortunately, these countries went through austerity policies between 1918 and 2000 because, of the concern associated with the CFA franc and especially, the fixed peg. So in conclusions, briefly, what are the alternatives to the CFA franc? But before addressing that question, I would like to summarize here why this CFA franc, still exists. I think the first reason is that the France managed to maintain a long-term control over the reproduction of political elites, namely through what I have called electoral imperialism. In fact, France has always, interfered in the political process of its former colonies, so that the March 2024 presidential election in Senegal was the first time a nationalist or a Pan-Africanist leader managed to conquer power via normal election since 1960 in the 6 countries south of the Sahara, formerly colonized by or under the tutelage of France. This may sound crazy to most of the people, but this has been the historical reality. The first time we have a leader committed to the development of his country, not chosen by France and who won normal elections, only happened last year in March 2024. The second reason is the dominance of neoclassical economics. Because for neoclassical economics, generally money is a veil and not an instrument of power. And neoclassical economics are generally happy with the low inflation and the so-called exchange rate stability of the Franc zone. They attribute the underdevelopment of the Franc zone to reasons other than the existence of the CFA franc. In contrast, heterodox voices have been very few, and their works have been generally silenced. Hence, they are still unknown. And third, there's also the Washington silent complicity. The International Monetary Fund is an institution traditionally dominated by France, and most of its managing directors since its creation have been French. And you could see that in this graph. We had many managing directors since 1946. But you could see here in this table that from 1963 with Pierre-Paul Schweitzer to 2000, in fact, it's a period of 37 years. Most of the managing directors have been French, except for a period of 5 years. So in terms of duration, at the top of the IMF, you would see that, the French has been often had managing directors that stay the longest at the top of the IMF. Michel Camdessou, who would go to the WTO, stayed 13 years as managing director. Pierre Poche was 10 years. Jacques de la Rozière, 9 years. Christine Lagarde, 8 years. So in total, you have 5 managing directors because, as we know, in fact, there's a kind of a European-American pact. The managing director of the IMF would be European, while, the president of the World Bank would be someone from the US, you see. And France has leveraged this power in its relationship with its own colonies, former colonies. And you could see that the 14 countries using the CFA franc had received since 1960 a total of 200 loans from the IMF because France will never use its so-called convertibility guarantee. Anytime these countries may face a balance of payment crisis, France will say the IMF will come, the IMF will impose austerity policies, and the World Bank will impose privatization policies. And this will first denationalize their economies and also kill their long-term growth prospects. So in terms of nominal value of these loans, 200 loans, they amounted to something like less than 90 billion US dollar in nominal terms. And these countries are very small. I mean, the countries of CFA franc, they are not among the richest. So that means that the French have used the international financial institutions to maintain their monetary dominance, their monetary domination over these countries. Here you have an excerpt from a book by a former World Bank chief economist, Kaushik Basu. He wrote this book, Policymakers Journal, and he said this about the CFA franc. On CFA, my lips are unfortunately supposed to be sealed. The CFA franc is a currency peg that the French had arranged with its former colonies in West and Central Africa. Despite the switch over of France from the franc to the euro, the peg now vis-a-vis the euro continues, which gives the ECB, the European Central Bank, an enormous amount of power over these West African economies. The peg cuts down on currency risk, but handicaps the region in terms of trade and exports capacity. However, this is treated as a topic that you could not even mention in West Africa because it may give ideas to nations like Senegal to break out of the peg. Before I set out on my West Africa mission, I was advised by my senior colleagues in Washington and also by the communication department not to ever bring up this topic when in Africa. To me, this marks of colonialism. Don't even plant ideas in the minds of the colonized. I violate this structure and raise the topic in my conversations with ministers and central bankers. However, and this I regretted later, I did not raise this when the media was present because I did not want to get a phone call from Washington. He wrote that in his book. So I mean, all of these things about the CFA franc, most of it is known by these institutions, but simply they had to stay silent. But now, I mean, since at least 2015, there have been more and more protests against the CFA franc in various, countries, across Africa to say that we are no longer happy with the CFA franc and we would have other kind of relationships with France. And some countries decided, I mean, in the past 2 years to remove all French troops on their territories. So what are the options to end the monetary status quo? I have identified 5 of them. The first is what I have called symbolic reformism. That means, for example, changing the name of the CFA franc, having banknotes and coins manufactured outside France, because most of the banknotes and coins, in fact, all the banknotes and coins are manufactured by the Bank of France, and half of the volume of work of the Bank of France consists in manufacturing this. The printing activity of the Bank of France consists for half in printing these coins and banknotes for the CFAs of our zone, and also reducing the deposit rate of foreign exchange reserve at the French Treasury. This is the kind of option championed by Emmanuel Macron, the current French president. But I mean, this is not no reform at all. The second option is adaptive reformism. That means making the parity of the CFA franc more flexible, Europeanizing further the CFA franc management in place of the French, for example, having a kind of European guarantee and representatives from Europe instead of French one. This proposal has been made by Dominique Strauss-Kahn, former French Minister of Finance, was also former managing director of the IMF. But I think this is wishful thinking and does not correspond to the desires of African peoples. You had the Bitcoin option, which for me is a desperate option. But one country, Central African Republic, choose to make Bitcoin a legal tender in a country which struggles, to have access to electricity and also to internet. The fourth option is neoliberal abolitionism. That means replacing the CFA franc as a monetary union by a large regional monetary union of the Eurozone type. In West Africa, we have this project for the 15 countries members of what is called the Economic Community for West African States. Since 1983, they had this project of a regional single currency that would be shared by all the 15 countries. But there are political reasons why this will never happen. And also, I mean, this would be a Eurozone type with all the, the shortcomings of the Euro, without the degree of trade and financial integration you have already in the Eurozone. The last options, which my preferred option, is the what I call sovereign abolitionism with solidary national currencies. That means all these countries should have their own national currencies, and they should go for monetary cooperation with rather than monetary union. They could find mechanism to pool their foreign exchange if they want. They could have regional payment and settlement system in their own currencies, and they could have, common food and energy policies to, in the framework of energy for industrial policy. That's what I would advocate. But obviously, as you all know, these are, political matters. So it depends on, the politicians to try to come up, with a reform or at least an option out of the status quo. So I have been long. I will stay there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What a fascinating look at something that we don't hear enough about. I have a very easy question, which is, could we please get a copy of your PowerPoint?
Yes, please.
We have somebody here, Peter, who I think he said he lived in Cameroon for a while and he didn't understand much of these economic things as a young teacher, but is so fascinated by it at the moment. I don't know if you're here, Peter. You still with us?
Peter's an economics teacher.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Yes, I'm here.
Thanks
Yeah,
for
I
your
lived in
presence.
in Yaoundé 20 something years ago teaching, but I was an IT teacher then, and I didn't understand anything about economics. I had never studied anything about economics. I was just teaching computer programming and things like that at the time. But I do remember people talking about this issue, but like people didn't really know. Like nobody really understands this. Like even working class people don't understand this. I would remember hearing complaints about things being too expensive because the CFA, they called it CFA, not the CFA, but it was pegged to the euro. So imported goods remain expensive, but their wages are staying the same. And of course, there was always like, why do we still use a French currency after independence? France is taking our money. Other African countries are doing better without the CFA, like Nigeria, Kenya, and so on and so on. And other people would say, well, this pegging creates stability, so it's good, so we can't abandon it. If we abandon it, prices will go up. What's going to happen to my salary if we abandon it? Things like that. That's what I remember from that time.
Could we ask, Ndongo, how widely is this understood? For example, in Senegal?
Yeah, in fact, for a long time, there had been a silence over the CFA franc. I mean, let's say from the 1960s to, let's say, 2015, there was no real public debate on the CFA franc, really. There had been episodically, I mean, in the 1970s, after the evaluation, there were some debates, intellectual debates, but these were not accessible to the broader public. It's only when people started to demonstrate, etc., and with also the advent of social media, etc., that people start to talk about the CFA franc. But they talk about the CFA franc in political terms. And that is really important because it's only in political terms that you could engage this topic. For example, why do we have a currency named CFA, which reminds us of, of the colonial times?
Yeah.
Why do we have our reserves, held in the French treasury? Why our banknotes are manufactured by the Bank of France? People started to talk about that. But the mechanisms in themselves, I mean, are unknown to many. Even, the the best economists, I would say, they don't understand how it works to some extent. So many people could not make, for example, I mean, the relationship, why do you have so much unemployment, underemployment? Why do you have a high cost of living? Why do you have this debt problem? They could not relate that, to the current system. They would just say, oh, maybe this is due to something else, mismanagement, etc., external crisis. But they would never make the link with that. And I think that has been one of the, reasons why this currency has survived so long, because many people did not understand it.
And it's related with unless Gabby sees a question that she wants to ask from that.
There were a couple, but yeah, carry on.
It's related to when Fadel talks about no decarbonisation without decolonisation. It's related to that, isn't it?
Yes, it's related because you could not ask for significant change on the international stage if you do not have your own house in order to some extent. For example, no, I mean change. I mean in the international monetary finance system would be beneficial to CFA franc countries as long as they remain within the system. So they have to leave that system. But leaving that system generally has been, avoided by the political elites because these political elites generally they have been also working in tandem with some section, of the French elites, etc. That means that basically it has been a political problem. And you have to decolonize to some extent. And decolonize meaning that having a national currency, having a domestic financial system, etc., and also using your own resources for your own development, etc. But we do not have that for now in Francophone Africa. That's why it is important that people understand that. When I was doing this book on the CFA franc, I mean, the thing is also, I found little intellectual support for the idea that monetary sovereignty is important. And that's where I encountered the modern money theory, in the sense that modern money theory say, oh, this is really important. You have to have your own currency, and monetary sovereignty is important if you want to do, I mean, interesting things for your country, for your people, etc. And that perspective, allowed me myself to understand better how the CFA franc worked. Because if I did not have this modern money perspective, maybe I would have come up with different conclusions of different approaches. So having this point of view of monetary sovereignty is really important. But but most of the people would not grasp it. But we have been making efforts to make people understand why money is so important and what you could do when you have a system of national currency connected with, functional banking and financial system.
It helps you avoid going down like a path like Bitcoin and things like that as a false solution. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's another easy question. Would we be able to get the link to your book on the CFA franc?
Yes.
That would be great.
Yeah.
I don't know if we can, I might be able to just find, is it findable on Google?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat there.
Yes, I have it. We can put it also underneath the, and we should put it in the chat now. We'll put it underneath the recording of the lecture so that everybody can read it.
There was a question from Yano back a bit. I had it, but I've lost it now.
Yano said, if not even top economists understand this, and I'd be interested in, I guess you've talked to top economists in the Ministry of Finance in Senegal, or you might be able to tell us what they say. How can you organize and mobilize people to act against that?
In fact, the people are acting. And it is through their mobilization that now the issue has gone public. And in Francophone Africa, the CFA franc has become illegitimate. Now, I would say we have won the intellectual battle. We have won it. We have won the argument. But now it's in the terrain of politics and reform. What should we do? But what you should do depends on what kind of view do you have about money. There are many people who are against the CFA franc. They would just assume, oh, we want to have a monetary union like the Eurozone. It would be fine because we will no longer have the French. We would have an African currency, Pan-Africanism, and this would work for us. People like myself, I thought, oh, it won't be that easy because if you have a monetary union, you'll have some of the constraints of the CFA franc. What do you want to do? These kind of things, you see. So now the question is, what should we do? But most of the people, when I say top economists, top economists in Francophone countries and even beyond in the diaspora, because I have seen very few people advocating, for example, a national currencies, for a country like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, they would just say that, oh, from a monetary perspective, at least you have low inflation and exchange rate stability. And that's only what you could ask for, monetary policy or your currency system. That's it. The other things have to be handled by, industrial policy, these kind of things. But every time I would say, oh, how could you have industrial policy if you have no, no credit, to the private sector? If you have an overvalued exchange rate, how could you have industrial policy, this kind of thing? But they would ignore all these kind of things. That's why I think this modern money perspective is really important, because it allows us, to understand how money works and the kind of things you could do with it. Because the money is an instrument that the state could use to mobilize its own resources. And the argument that, you can use, the money system in a way that would be really developmental in the South, etc. This argument does not hold, because in some sense, modern money theory makes the difference between, financial constraints and real resource constraints. In the CFA Franc, we have financial constraints and real resource constraint. Now, you could ease this financial constraint by having another monetary framework. And now you have to handle your real resource constraint, because what is generally called the external constraint is not really an external constraint. It's a real resource constraint that is expressed in a foreign currency. So that means that you have the space to, to finance yourself projects that would increase your domestic capacities in a way that will, address these real resource constraints. Because generally, when people talk about balance of payment constraints, I think it's really confused. What you have basically is real resource constraints, and some of them have an external dimension, because you have to acquire the foreign currency to do that. But you could do through economic planning what is needed to have access to this critical, real resources that have to be acquired in foreign currency. So the modern money perspective is really very helpful when you think from a planning perspective, and that's the the type of perspective I use to say that we need a national currency, but having a national currency does not mean that there is no solidarity between us. There could be a mechanism of solidarity. We could partially pull our foreign exchange. Why should we trade in US dollar or in euro? There is no necessity. This is a self-imposed constraint. We could trade, and for that you do not need any monetary union, etc. So there are many things we could do, but this depends on the view you have on money. If you just say money is about lowering transaction costs, etc., this microeconomic argument, you could not see the potential for, a national currency.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a question from Rachel, which is about the differences and the. I've lost it. There's quite a bit of chat going on, but about the differences between the diversity of countries. So I found it now. I'll read it. The CFA countries' economies are quite diverse, some large, some very small, some large agricultural exporters, some oil exporters, some net energy importers, etc. Would this help the diversity? Would this help countries to move forward together as a cooperating monetary sovereign nations, or would it complicate matters?
Well, yeah, these countries are diverse to some extent in terms of size, in terms of export orientation, etc. But I think that most of these countries should have their own national currency. Senegal should have its own national currency. Cameroon, Guinea, etc. Even small nations.
Yeah.
A country like Equatorial Guinea with less than 2 million population should be among the richest countries in the world.
Yeah.
These countries, there should be no poverty, but they have been making wrong choices. I went through, the IMF classification of exchange rates, etc., because it's an annual report by the IMF. And there is no country across the world that is exporting oil and gas and that choose to peg its currency to the euro. There's none. There's only the CFA Franc countries. That means there is no economic rationale at all. It's just a political rationale. So why would these countries do that? You see, this is not, no. Most of these countries could have their own national currency, because Africa is not poor. Africa has been impoverished by the international monetary financial system, the global system, but also their elites, But that means that if you are committed, to a form of developmentalism, green developmentalism, and you have the adequate instrument, There are many things that these countries could do. My own thinking is about what could we do given the current, constraints we have at the world level. That's my thinking. But because I think that there are many things we could do, even within, this global constraint, but we are not doing that. But I think most of these countries, if they have the good leadership, they reconquer their instruments of policy. There are many things they could do, but they could cooperate in different ways. For example, I think in Africa, it's really critical to have an African payment system, payment and settlement system, because there is no need to trade between ourselves using foreign currencies. This is something easier to do than to have a currency union. But people will say, oh, let's go to the currency union first and after we see.
Yeah.
But let's have this African payment and settlement system. We can have it regional level or continental level. These are practical things. We need also to coordinate our industrial policies. There are many things we could do. But when you are a nation, you should have your own currency, you see. If you are a federal state, maybe I could understand. Maybe you share a common currency. There are only 4 monetary unions, currently. When I say currency unions, I mean sovereign states accepting to share a single currency issued by a common central bank. There are only 4. You have the 2 CFA zones. You have the East Caribbean Currency Unit, 6 countries and 2 British dependencies in the Caribbean, and you have the Eurozone. And the Eurozone is the only post-colonial monetary union that is surviving.
Yeah.
So that means that even countries might have dollarized currencies, etc., currency boards, etc. But the principle is one territory, one country, one currency. And the population size of these 4 monetary unions is less than 7% of total population, world population. So yeah, that should be the principle, I think.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Rachel, do you want to add any comments there? Feel free to unmute. I can see you on the screen.
Can Rachel unmute? Rachel can't unmute.
No? Okay. We'll come back to you maybe. There we are. Yeah.
You let me unmute. I couldn't before. Yes, no, thank you very much for that answer. And I totally agree with everything you said. I was really sort of also wondering about, whether how cooperation was between those countries post CFA Franc, when that's dissolved and they have monetary sovereignty, to what extent the diversity of the economies would be a strength, and to what extent it might, what sort of precautions would need to be taken to ensure that the new arrangements benefited everyone. But I think you basically you answered that by talking about the benefits of monetary sovereignty per se. So thank you.
There was one other question. There was one other question here relating to France, from Kim. Through the establishment of the Eurozone, other European countries have interest in keeping the CFA franc system, or is it really only France that's the main driver?
I would say that there is no genuine interest from European countries as such, even if they might benefit from, this environment of so-called monetary stability, because there is no exchange rate risk, there is no transfer risk when you invest in CFA franc zone, in euro, etc. So you could see that. But these benefits are not, limited to France or Eurozone countries. I mean, all foreign investors, as long as they accept, to function in euro, etc., they have these kind of benefits, you see. But when the CFA franc they decided to peg the CFA franc against the euro, it was a pure French business. The France made all the legal steps in order to make sure that the CFA franc would be pegged against the euro. African governments were not involved, So the French always used this as for its own economic benefits, but also now it's becoming more and more a political tool to discipline these countries. I will give you one example. Whenever you had African leaders that disobeyed French orders or are in trouble with France, France did not hesitate to weaponize the CFA franc system. And this is linked to monetary sovereignty. You know why? Because monetary sovereignty is a bulwark against uh, international financial sanctions. You know,
Yep.
foreign countries could seize your foreign exchange reserves, etc., could seize your foreign assets, etc. But no foreign country could order your central bank to deprive the government of its access to its own bank accounts or to the
Yep.
domestic financial system. But in the CFA franc, this has been possible. 3 times, France asked the central bank to shut down the access of the government to its own bank accounts and to the domestic finances. It happened in Cote d'Ivoire in 2011. It happened in Mali from January 2022 to the summer, and it happened in Niger from the summer of 2023. Every time this government no longer had access to their own bank accounts at the central bank, at the domestic banks, and they were defaulting on their sovereign debts because the central bank organized that. And this central bank is under legal tutelage of the French Treasury. So you see that, well, when you are monetarily sovereign, no one could do you that. They could seize your foreign assets, but they couldn't give no order to your central bank to not facilitate, your fiscal and monetary operations. See.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of people that are studying the violence of colonialism, but not enough people, like you say, understand how money and currency are a driver and enabler of this in an ongoing way.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's true. That's true in the sense that I wrote somewhere provocatively that neoliberalism in itself is an iteration of the colonial logic in substance, because under colonialism, in fact, the doctrine of budget balance under neoliberalism came from the colonial period. At that time, it was called Gladstonian finance after the British Prime Minister, Gladstone, because they were saying that, oh, you the colonists, you are adventurers. You go there in Africa, etc., you will receive no money from the metropole. You'll have to, pay for your own spending there. And at that time, there were no sovereign currencies in the metropole because they were, pegged, against gold, etc. It was the international gold standard. In the colonies, in fact, it was, the metropolitan currency that circulated. So that means that the governments were budget constrained to some extent. And they relied heavily on taxation to do that enforced labor, you see. So the doctrine of budget balance came from there. And because there were no developmental deficits, you see that colonialism for many countries in Africa had been a disaster economically speaking. I mean, limited development in terms of infrastructure, limited, development in terms of creating educated workforce, these kind of things. See. But now we are in the same logic. And most of the African people, the African governments, they did not disconnect from this colonial logic because they still think that you need taxes to spend. For example, when you lead at a very progressive leader like Nyerere, he said, oh, if people ask us to spend more, in fact, they are asking us to tax them more. And sometimes you could not take more from the people, etc. Because there's no understanding, of how the modern money system works. So if you have a sovereign currency, there are many things you could do, but simply they think they don't have the money. And so they say, oh, we have to find the money elsewhere. But, the thing is about real resources because you could always find the money. And I think we need to try to, have this conversation so that they will delink with the colonial paradigm, because most of our macroeconomic framework, especially under neoliberalism, is the colonial one. You need to tax more the people in order to spend, because it has been very difficult to tax the richest extra. And the richest in our countries is the companies operating in the export sector, you see. And generally, the World Bank and IMF have made sure that they are really protected.
And people don't understand, for the most part, even very progressive people, that the countries of the so-called global north are not developing the global south, that it's the other way around, that there's a transfer through one in one form or another, legal and illicit financial transfers of something like $2 trillion a year from Africa and the rest of the global south to the global north. I saw somebody referring to aid or not being a beggar in the questions. It's the other way around. Africa and other countries in the global south, they provide the mass of the world's low-cost labor, cheap resources. They're where we sell stuff that we don't want to buy ourselves
Rare metals
anymore.
that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. A variety of materials which don't exist in Europe, for example. So the wealth is in Africa. It's not in Europe, but we still have a global system which is effectively a colonial system which extracts resources cheaply from Europe and keeps from Africa and keeps Europe and to an extent Australia and the US as well rich. And this just seems one of the most extreme elements in that system. Do you agree with that, Ndongo?
I totally agree with that, because we are in a system, most of the I mean, in the mainstream literature, there is this so-called Lucas paradox, saying that, oh, normally, finance should flow from, the rich countries to the developed ones, because normally, finance is abundant in the global north. And so normally it would go to the global south to develop the global south and also reap higher returns, etc. You see. But in fact, as Prof. Stephen Hale said, in fact, it's the other way around. There had been a net pattern of resource transfers from the global south to the global north. And basically, you could have two mechanisms. The one is about the foreign debt, because most of these countries are indebted in foreign currencies. And generally, they are subject to high interest rate or high yields. And sometimes the debt is simply unsustainable in the sense that, in fact, well, you could only sustainably, quote unquote, repay your debt if you manage to export more. But as the price of your exports are cheapened to some extent, so it becomes very, very difficult, to service your debt. You see, and this has been one mechanism. But the one other mechanism that people do not talk about, and which has been a focus of my work, is the repatriation of profits and dividend by foreign companies. Because most of the people talking about debt, foreign debt, they say, oh, I mean, the asset management companies are not very bad, are not very good, etc. They are exploiting Africa because I mean, high interest rate, high yields on government bonds, etc. But the thing is, the returns on foreign debt investment are higher than the returns on foreign debt. And myself, generally, I take the two graphs showing that, oh, these are what is, what is going out of Africa as interest payment, as debt service or external debt, and these are the profit and dividend repatriation by foreign debt investment. And I say, if you had a control over that, I mean technical and fiscal control, maybe you would not have needed to issue debt in foreign currency, because you would have obtained, the desired amount of US dollar to buy for your imports, these kind of things. So that means that many things we could have done through more technical and fiscal control over the sectors that generate the hard currency. But no, this has been a way of plundering the continent through, so-called illicit financial flows, these kind of things, going through tax havens, these kind of things. So the continent has been plundered, but there are ways, also of changing that. I mean, even while maintaining this current, system, I'm not defending this system, but generally I oppose the view that nothing could happen internally as long as you do not change, the global structures. I oppose that, because when you do that, that means that, you are ready to see more and more suffering unless you have very substantive change that may or may not happen. There are many things that could be done, at national level. I mean, in a way that is not, impinging on the sovereignty of others, etc. There are many things you could do at the national level. And if we do that, I mean, there will be possibility of economic improvement for Africa and generally for the global south, and for the whole world. That's why I think that modern money perspective is really interesting, because it allows you to see the constraint. I think you could not have genuine economic development in a framework of both technological dependency and financial dependency. You could have financial dependency for a time to accumulate, the foreign resources you need to build your domestic capacity extra. And after that, maybe you escape financial dependency. But if you are in framework of a financial dependency and you still remain, in technological dependency, it will be very difficult. You have to invest yourself to create your own, innovation, creative, base domestically, so that, you could, escape, from these forms of dependency. But we have not been doing that. And we have been told by the IMF and the World Bank, you have to rely on foreign finance for your own economic development. And I don't think this is possible over a long-term basis. You could not rely for your own development on foreign finance. I'm not saying that we do not need foreign finance, but you have to be selective about foreign finance, because what you want is not the finance, but the real resources that foreign finance is supposed to buy or to bring home, you see. But we have not been making this difference, and I think this is really important.
Thank you so much, Ndongo, for the terrific presentation and all the answers as well. I think we'd probably best bring it to a close.
Yes.
There's
There's some great
It's getting
questions.
very late.
There's some great questions that we haven't gotten to, and I'm sorry for those people. Mostly about other countries and China's influence, and it would be great to have you back as a speaker for a future event, and maybe we can gather up some questions before as well. Perhaps maybe a Q&A type session might be really, really useful. If you'd be willing, that would be great. There's so much interest there, and we'd love to get a copy of your PowerPoint, and we'll also put a link to your book in the comment on the description of the recording. So thank you so much. I will stop the recording, I think, now. But yeah, really grateful for you to give us your time. It's a wonderful session. Thanks.
There are lots of interviews with Dr. Sylla on Facebook as well, so you're not just restricted to listening to this one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation, the great question. It had been really a pleasure for me to be here, to have this conversation. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much. It's most informative.